Welcome to RotaRail Tech Series Episode 8. Today I'm going to show you measuring port timing and plug those numbers into a spreadsheet and just kind of describe what that means for things like injector, duty cycle and phase angle. First off, here's our timing wheel. So I 3D printed this one especially to fit the hub. This is a standard bolt pattern used on superchargers typically. So I just made up a timing wheel and an indicator, the bolt on the front, and it measures in before top dead center. Because I've just kind of mocked up the engine to show you, I'm actually going to measure the rear rotor. So I put this 180 degrees out to give you numbers as though it was the front rotor. So I'll show you using the exhaust port. It's just a little bit easier. So what we are trying to do is measure, because it's peripheral port basically, the points where the seal shuts off one face, which is the exhaust close on this face here, and then here is where the exhaust opening is for this chamber here. So to do that, feeler gauge, this one's 6th hour. The SAE standard for piston engines is 6th hour for advertised duration. So I'm just using this. It's not super critical because this is all just kind of approximate, but just using it to show you. So basically put the feeler gauge up above the apex seal, just wind it around till it just hits, and then we can go around and read off the angle. And it's a little hard to read, but it's about where are we now? 127 degrees. So that's the exhaust closing before top dead center, and then the exhaust opening on this other chamber. Is around 173 degrees. And then the process for the intake's exactly the same. So measuring them all in before top dead center, and then I'll plug them into a spreadsheet, and that'll convert them into kind of the timing numbers that I need. So why is injector phase angle important? It's obviously important in a piston engine because, you know, whether you inject on the back of an inlet valve or when the valve's open, it makes a difference to emissions and fuel economy and power, basically, because it affects the way the fuel gets vaporized and also how much raw fuel goes out the exhaust. So in a peripheral port rotary, the challenge is that you have a lot of overlap, and so what you don't want to be doing, so here we're at about 180 degrees here. If you injected the fuel here, a large part of the fuel is going to go out the exhaust port, and because you've got so much overlap, you know, 100 degrees or more, so it's going to continue to get pushed out the exhaust port until exhaust closing. So basically what you want to do is that rather than starting to inject fuel here, where it's going to get pushed out the exhaust port during overlap, is finish injecting here, which is the end of the intake stroke. And so that basically has a huge effect on how much of the fuel makes it into the chamber, because if you're pushing a lot of fuel out the exhaust, the other thing that can happen if you've got combustion happening in the exhaust is that you can get a false O2 sensor reading, and so it'll show that you're not running lean, but you might actually be lean in the chamber because a lot of the fuel's burnt in the exhaust and not in the chamber. Okay, so here's the spreadsheet that I put together for this. So you can see up here in the timing section, I put in the before top dead center values that are recorded for inlet open close and exhaust open and close. This is calculated the overlap as 136 degrees, 426 degrees of intake duration, and 407 degrees of exhaust. The reason the intake's more than the exhaust is because the intake port is taller, being round, than the kind of oval-shaped exhaust port. What this spreadsheet also lets me do is put in some other basic information about the engine. So I've got my primary and secondary injectors, flow in pound per hour, the dead time, what injection angle I'd like to look at, and then the RPM, and then it calculates based on the RPM cycle time, which is the total time for a complete cycle of the engine. So at 2000 RPM, it's 30 milliseconds per revolution. Based on the flow, calculates injection time, duty cycle, what percentage the dead time, this dead time figure here is of the overall time for the cycle. And then it also calculates what the total number of degrees is to get this flow, and then at this engine speed, and then what the start angle has to be to get this start angle here to get this end of injection angle that I want, and then how much earlier than that the ECU actually has to trigger the injector because of the dead time, because it takes time for the coil to saturate and the pin tool to actually open. So you can drop down here and pick the different RPM. So we'll just show 2000 first. So this is at idle, only running on the primaries. So on the plot down the bottom, the two things we're really looking at is this grey line. And so this represents where we're in overlap. And then the orange red line, so that red part is the dead time, and the orange is the actual time fuel's flowing through the injector. So when I put the injection angle as 90, it's just before the overlap. So we want a complete injection before overlap, which is when the intake opens. If I just change this to 180, so it actually happens in the middle of overlap, you can see why that'd be bad, because pretty much all the fuel is just going to go straight out the exhaust. That can be useful if you've got an oversized primary injector, but is otherwise terrible for fuel consumption and trying to get a good tune in the car. So just pop that back to 90. And so what you can see here, I'm going to show you at 10,000 RPM. So we were turning the motor to about 95, 96 last season. And what you can see is that pretty much we're out of injector time. So at 10,000, we're actually about 95% duty cycle. And so, a lot of the fuel's going out the exhaust. Doesn't give you a lot of tunability in terms of where you inject the fuel. And typically, you don't probably really want to be above 80% with an atomizer injector, because they're pretty, just get a bit grumpy if you go too high. So we're kind of borderline. This was with the 850 primaries and 1100 secondaries in the car last season. And so what we want to do is basically be able to inject the same or more fuel in less time. So the way to do that is you put bigger injectors in. So we've added another 4 1100 injectors. So now we have 1700 primaries and 6600 combiner secondaries. So you can see now, and we'll be turning the motor to nearly 11,000 this year. So you can see here that the orange, which is the bit where the fuel's actually getting put into the engine, is quite a bit shorter than the time we have available between the overlap. And so this means that we've got a bit of flexibility to move this around to basically tune it for best power or richest tune, so that we can get the fueling right and not be putting too much fuel out the exhaust to mess with the O2 sensor, and stay well away from this overlap area as much as we can. That should help us all around because we've only got a 3-gallon tank in the car, and so because we're bracket racing, make it shut down on the line, not have time to refuel, all that sort of stuff. So we want to keep the fuel consumption at idle fairly reasonable, and then we want to be able to so we can move this to avoid the overlap on idle, and then we can at higher RPM we can specify the end injection angle in the fuel tank where we want it to kind of optimize the timing of this. So any questions on this, just drop the message, and if you're interested in a copy of the spreadsheet, I can paste it up on our Facebook page. Thanks for watching.